Okay, welcome to our last lecture for Unit 1. We're going to be talking today about origin of species, which is defined in Chapter 24. We're going to talk about how species are formed, so how do new species come to be, and then kind of on the flip side of that, how does nature try to prevent new species from forming? Okay, so I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here on this lecture, I feel like, but we're going to talk about how new species come about and then how nature prevents that from happening. So, two different things that are occurring here. So, speciation, right? That's a process in which one species splits into two or more species. Now, before we go into talk about how that's possible, let me just give you a couple of definitions, a few of which are going to be hopefully review. So, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about macroevolution. The last was microevolution, but here we're talking about evolution above the level of just a single species. So we're looking at a bigger scale globally. So that's macroevolution. Remember that a biological species means that this is a group of members within the population who have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay? And they're not supposed to be able to do that with members of other such groups. So, for example, in A here in figure 24.2, you've got two different species of bird. They look very similar to one another. And maybe, I don't know, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, they were designated as the same species, but they're in fact not the same species. So because they're not the same species, theoretically, they should not be able to mate. Here, even though you have 6 organisms that look very different from one another, they are members of the same species and therefore should be able to mate. Now, a lot of this is going to revolve around this idea of speciation, is going to revolve around reproductive isolation. And I did mention that in the previous lecture, but just for a review so you understand what's happening here, is that when species are reproductively isolated from one another, there's some sort of a barrier that would prevent members from being able to reach each other and then therefore interbreeding. And that can be a biological barrier, or that can be a barrier within the geology or the topography of the earth, right? So it's just some mechanism that prevents the two members of different species from mating. Okay, so we're going to go on and we're going to talk then about how species are formed. How do new species come to be? And there are two mechanisms that allow for that. We have what's called allopatric speciation, and then we have what's called sympatric speciation. And I'm going to go ahead and start with allopatric speciation first. So this is number 4 on page 12 near the bottom of the page. Okay, so with allopatric speciation, guys, what you need to remember is that this is due solely to changes in the geology or the topography of an area. So if we start then by looking at this plot, you've got trees here, and what the author wants you to assume is that every single tree that's here, because they look alike, they're about the same size and the same shape, you're supposed to assume that these are all members of the same species. Now, not overnight, right? We know that things like mountain ranges forming and Grand Canyons forming, they take millions of years. In fact, I think that they discovered that they were able to figure out that it took 20 million years for the Rocky Mountain Range to form. So again, this is not anything that's going to happen overnight, but it does happen slowly over time. But in this original area, there were shifts of the tectonic plates, and you have a mountain range that forms. And when that mountain range forms, it splits then the original population into two different populations on two different sides of the mountain range. Now, I'm calling these two different populations, which means then that they eventually become two different species. And two different species form because of changes in the topography, which then allow for reproductive isolation to be met. If I were to ask you, how likely is it that pollen from these trees over here, from the original population, let's just call that species A, how likely is it that pollen is going to get up and over the mountain range, make it down here into a pine cone when the pine cone is completely ready to accept pollen grains to fertilize the egg cell in the ovule cone. That's highly, highly, highly unlikely to happen. If I decide that I want to collect some pollen from this population of species A, and I can hike up and over the mountains and I try to hand pollinate, right, maybe some of these trees, here, there could be a successful mating, especially if they're not yet genetically distinct from one another. But again, that's very unlikely to happen. So because of a change in the geography, these gametes here are not able to meet with these gametes over here. Therefore, these become their own distinct species. We'll call them species B. And again, the author wants you to understand that that's what's happening by drawing them to be similar in size and shape, but a different color, so you know that this is now a new species. And then obviously, the more time that goes on, right, the more time that passes, these are going to become, species A and species B are going to become more and more genetically distinct from one another, because living on this side of the mountain range, for example, you're going to be exposed to different environmental pressures than maybe what's happening over here on this side of the mountain range. So it's not uncommon to see very different plants growing on different sides of the mountain range due to light, due to temperature, and due to moisture. So if you're growing on an eastern facing slope, you're going to receive your sun in the morning. When it's cooler, perhaps you're going to get more moisture. That gives a very different type of an environment, right, compared to the western facing slope, which is going to get their sun in the afternoon during the hottest part of the day, increasing the temperature and probably less amounts of moisture. And so different adaptations have to evolve based on different types of climates maybe that are happening on either side of the mountain range. Another example of allopatric speciation has to do, again, here is our Grand Canyon. And you can see that you have two rodent species and they look very similar to one another. Safe to assume, right, that they have a very recent common ancestor, because if you look, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but that's the name of the genus that they both fall under, but they have different species. So at one point, these two organisms could have been members of the same species and therefore they were reproducing. But when one of the species is isolated to this side of the Grand Canyon, and this is on this side of the Grand Canyon, they're exposed to different environmental pressures. And if you look, just the vegetation alone, just right here, is very different than the vegetation over here. This is very desert-like. This is more alpine-like. So obviously, those are going to give different conditions. And then again, the likelihood that this one here is going to try to, journey all the way down its side of the Grand Canyon, up the other side of the Grand Canyon to go mate, that's just ridiculous. It would never try that because it knows that it would never ever make that journey. And so the more time that goes on, then the more genetically distinct these organisms will be. Okay, really quickly, just to finish up with the last example, allopatric speciation. So you've got fish that are really close to one another, but in their own separate pools of water, if you will, because of this mound right here, then causing reproductive isolation. And so, again, they will just become more and more distinct as time goes on. Okay, let me go over here then to sympatric speciation. And that occurs in populations that live in the same geographic area. Now, what I want you to do, because this is going to be really, really complex for me to try to explain to you in a video without having the whiteboard there and have this discussion with you. I want you to cross off 1, polyploids, and then A, autopolyploidy, and B, allopolyploidy. I will not ask you about the distinction between those two terms, so again, you can cross it off. What I would like for you to put in your notes here for sympatric speciation is simply this. It occurs when you have two species mate, giving hybrids, right? So you have two species that are able to mate, and when they successfully mate, then they're going to have hybrids for offspring. So for example, if we have species A here and species B there, but because they are not reproductively isolated, they are able to mate. They're going to try to mate, and when the mating happens to work, then they will have species C as their offspring, which would be a hybrid. Now that breaks the rule, right? or not the rule, I'm sorry, but that totally throws the definition of a species out the window, where you're only supposed to mate with only members of your own species. Once in a while, that rule is broken, and that then would be this right here, an example of sympatric speciation. So right smack in the middle of the original environment, you could add, for example, envision a third fish that's red, and that would be the hybrid then that comes from species A and species B. Now, sometimes when a hybrid forms, the hybrid doesn't live long and it dies, so it doesn't really count as a form of speciation because it's never going to be able to reproduce and then therefore pass on its genes. So even though there was a mating attempt and you did get a hybrid, it doesn't do anything beyond that. Sometimes though, you can get then, if these two were to cross and the genetics just line up perfectly and you get a hybrid for species C, it actually could have the potential to outcompete or do as well as either parental species, species A and species B. And sometimes they just get the best set of genes from each parent, making them strong, vigorous hybrids. Okay, so I'll go on and elaborate with that here in just a little bit. But again, for sympatric speciation, go ahead and cross off polyploidy, allopolyploidy, and just know that sympatric speciation results then when two species mate and they have offspring, and we refer to those offspring as hybrid. And this is going to occur when there is no reproductive isolation. No reproductive isolation. Okay, so those are some instances that can occur on the planet, but sometimes the Mother Nature doesn't want new species to form, because if you can imagine having, for example, all of these random hybrids in the ocean or on land, that are alive, might not have anything that they are compatible enough to mate with. And so what good is that? Because they can't reproduce, they can't pass on their genes. So that defies everything that biology represents. So we have what are called pre and post zygotic barriers. So I'm on the last page of the notes here at the top of page 13. And the goal here is to prevent the formation of hybrids. Okay, so pre and post zygotic barriers. Now, when we look at the term, the zygotic, that just refers to the zygote, guys. And the zygote is going to form when a sperm cell fertilizes an egg cell. If pre is in front of that, that means that this some sort of barrier is going to happen, preventing a zygote from forming. So the barrier happens before the zygote forms. In post-zygotic, a barrier is going to apply after the formation of a zygote. Okay, so let's go ahead and start then talking about pre-zygotic barriers. And so we have what's called temporal isolation, habitat isolation, and behavioral isolation. I'm going to go through these three with you and give you examples. And all three of these are going to prevent any sort of mating attempt from occurring. Okay, so two different species are never even going to try to mate. But sometimes two different species do try to mate. And so in this case, this is what this means. There is a mating attempt. And when there is a mating attempt between members of two different species, then mechanical and gametic isolation events can kick in, preventing the formation of a zygote. But let's say that there is a mating attempt and mechanical nor gametic isolation prevents that from happening, then you actually do get a zygote that is made from two different species. That then is when our post-zygotic barriers are going to kick in. Okay, so let's back up and let's start with these up here, beginning with temporal isolation. So in temporal isolation, this has everything to do with timing. Now, we as humans, we don't really think about mating seasons, for example, because we don't really have to think about that. But most often, animal and plant species, they only are able to reproduce at very specific times. So, for example, if you've got these two different skunk species that are living right next to each other, maybe they're both diurnal, so they're active during the day. They see each other. They're of the same genus, but just a different species. They could potentially mate, and maybe if you brought them into the zoo and you put the egg and the sperm together, they would make a hybrid, but that's never ever going to happen in nature because they mate at different times. Now, the different times could be as simple as just within the day, okay? But because I said that these were both diurnal, active during the day, then this could be where this species of skunk over here on the left, maybe it mates during the first three weeks of spring, and that's it. The window closes. And this mates just during the first 2 weeks of fall. And I'm just making this up just for example's sake. But if this one is not ready to mate when this one is, and this one's not ready to mate when that one is, then there obviously will be no mating attempt whatsoever. And so if they don't even try to mate with each other because their timings are off, then there will be no formation of a zygote from these two different species. Okay, habitat or ecological isolation, two names for the same thing here. And you've got two different species of garter snake that are closely related, except that one is aquatic and one is terrestrial. Now, this could be living on the land that butts right up against on the banks of the shore of the water where this one lives, but this one is never going to leave the water, and this one's never going to go into the water. And so they are isolated to their specific habitats or ecology. Usually we talk about it as being habitat isolation, but it's habitat or ecological isolation. So again, they probably know that the other one is there, but this one here, for example, is never going to slither across its territory, go into the water to mate with this one, and this one's never going to come out of the water to go over here and mate with this one. And so because they are contained within their own habitats then, there, again, will be no mating attempt, and no mating attempt means no formation of a zygote from the two different species. Okay, behavioral isolation. So this is a picture that we are similar to a picture that we've seen before. So birds, again, are really, really good at this, and this is going to be mating attempts or lack thereof based solely on the behavior of the organism. And so you have the male blue-footed booby here doing a dance for a potential female mate here. And she either is going to be receptive or not. But if this blue-footed booby, for example, got a little bit confused and went and did his dance in front of a peacock or a peahen, this dance means nothing to the peahen. And so there would be no sort of a connection, no mating attempt, then obviously no zygote. Okay, once in a while though, you do have different species that do attempt to mate with one another, and there are mechanisms in place to prevent then the sperm and the egg from reaching one another. And this one would be mechanical isolation. So you've got to give it to the snails. They are really trying to reproduce here, but they just can't because of the mechanics. So their copulatory organs, which are right where the tips of the white arrows are, so the opening is here for this snail, the opening is there for that snail. And if they don't align, then they cannot exchange gametes, even though they're really trying to do that. What would need to happen is, it's really interesting with snails. So the spiraling here of the shell is going clockwise. The spiraling of the shell here is counterclockwise, and when that happens, then the copulatory organs do not align. So this one here, for example, we need to go and find then a snail of its own species, and that shell would have to go in that direction. That would then have an alignment of the copulatory organs. Something else that's unique about the snails is that they are hermaphroditic. Not that that's unique, because many animals are. And if you don't know what hermaphroditic is, that is when an animal can make both sets of gametes, both sperm and egg cells. And usually when that happens, it's the exchange of sperm cells that occurs. But in this case, they would each release, if the copulatory organs could align, they would each release eggs. And then they would take the eggs that they received from the other snail and then fertilize them internally with their own sperm cells. So kind of a unique way of reproducing. But again, because the two species copulatory organs do not align, then there will be no formation of a zygote. Many insects are prevented from mating because of mechanical isolation. So the male copulatory organ does not align with the female copulatory organ of two different species. Okay, so listen, in the water, think about, going out to the beach and going for a swim in the ocean. I kind of think that this is funny, but when you are swimming in the ocean, guys, you are literally swimming in a sea of gametes. Because if you think about it, organisms like your sea urchin that you have pictured here, the only way that they can reproduce, because they're animals, they also have sperm and egg just like we do, right? They have to just release their gametes out into the open ocean and hope that those gametes find the compatible gamete to mate with. So here, these two sea urchins, because they're of the same species, are going to release sperm and egg into the water, and because they're in close proximity, hopefully the sperm and egg, as they're spewed out into the water, will find one another. The sperm cell will fertilize the egg cell, and then you'll get a zygote, and then you'll get viable offspring. And they find each other using chemical cues and pheromones. But this sea urchin over here is doing the same thing. And let's say that this is a male, and it's going to just dump sperm cells all over the area of this sea urchin and this sea urchin. But because this sea urchin is of a different species, the genetics within the sperm cell are not compatible with the egg of these over here. Therefore, you will not have the formation of a zygote because the sperm cells are prevented from fertilizing the egg cells. So again, there is a mating attempt here. The sperm and the egg are going to become close in proximity, but they're not genetically compatible enough to be able to actually have fertilization. They cannot fuse together. Okay, so that is it for the prezygotic barriers. Hopefully those are pretty self-explanatory. Postzygotic barriers, again, you have a mating attempt between two different species. You have the formation of a zygote, but what happens to the zygote, or what happens to the offspring that develop from that zygote that has formed from two different species? So we are here. We're going to be looking at reduced hybrid viability. One option, reduced hybrid fertility, and then reduced hybrid breakdown. And what is happening here is that these barriers are going to try somehow, some way, to prevent the hybrid offspring from passing its genetics on to future generations. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, here we have reduced hybrid viability. And the viability basically is saying that this hybrid salamander that you have pictured here, the viability of it is not high. It's a very weak animal. And so if it's a very weak animal, the chances of it reproducing and passing on its genetics are very low to not at all. So this, let's say that this is a male hybrid salamander, and out of all of the salamanders that the females have to choose from in this area, this is going to be the weakest of the bunch. And you know that a female is not going to choose the weakest, it's going to go for the strongest male. And so this one may never ever just simply be selected to mate with because of its fragile state. In addition to that, what can also happen here under reduced hybrid viability is that the animal, because it's so frail, never reaches sexual maturity. So yes, the zygote's formed. Yes, you have a hybrid salamander that is born, but because it's so frail, it does not ever reach the age of sexual maturity. And so it would die before it even has the chance of reproducing. And so again, that would be then a preventative measure from allowing this hybrid salamander to passing on its genetics to future generations or to future offspring. This is one I'm sure that you're quite familiar with. This is reduced hybrid fertility. So this is when you're going to have a horse and it crosses with a donkey, right? Obviously two different species here, but genetically they're compatible enough so that when they do mate, they make a mule. Now, a mule is not fragile like the salamander that we just gave in the previous example. A mule is a very strong animal, right? It can be a pack animal. And a mule is a mule. It is born sterile. So reduced hybrid fertility, it can reach old age, so it could reach the age of reproduction, but even though it reaches that age, it does not have the capacity to reproduce and then therefore pass on its genes because it is born sterile. It does not have the organs, right, to make gametes. So it cannot make egg cells and it cannot make sperm cells. So this mule will never have the opportunity to mate. Lastly, we have what is called hybrid breakdown. Now, hybrid breakdown is where you actually do have hybrid offspring that mate, but only one time. So in this example, you have these maybe are the parental rice parents, and they are both hybrids. They do cross, they do mate, and this is their offspring. And so two hybrids mate, here is their offspring, but the offspring here is born, or not born, but it develops then sterility, which means that it will not be able to reproduce. And so yes, the genetics of the hybrids were able to reproduce, but only one generation, because then its generation would be born sterile. Okay, and that's very different than this one here. The mule then never, ever, ever gets to reproduce, but these hybrid rice do, making though only one generation, and then this generation would not be able to reproduce itself, and so the genes would never be passed on any further than just that one generation. And you can see that this generation right here, even though it's sterile, is very, very weak. And so this would not be a rice plant, of course, that you would want to have in your field, or this would not be the species that you would grow, because it's not going to get you very much. Okay, now let's assume that even though all of these barriers were in place, there was a mating, it works, this doesn't happen, and you end up with viable, fertile offspring. In other words, these would be hybrids, right? So there are no barriers in place. So this would be the example then of sympatric speciation, where you have two different species, here and here, the red and the yellow species. They are able to have a successful union. They do mate, and they make strong, viable offspring. So this would be the example that I was talking about, where maybe these get the best set of both genes from the two hybrid parents, and they maybe are able to outcompete, or at least keep up with the two parental parents. Here is an example of when that happens. So you can have a grizzly bear that can mate with a polar bear, and when that happens, then you get this cross right here of a growler bear, right? Do you like how they just sandwich those names together? So there's your growler bear. Now, this is not likely to happen very often in nature, but it can, okay? Sometimes we have hybrids, like maybe you've heard of ligers and tyons before, where they have a successful mating of a tiger and a lion, or a lion and a tiger. The first name of the hybrid is always indicative of the female. So if you're talking about a liger, then that's the female was the lion, or a tyon, the tiger was the female. But again, even though it can happen in nature, it doesn't normally happen in nature. And sometimes, and I'm not saying for the example of the growler bear, but for the ligers and the tyons, that would be something that we would see in a zoo setting, because tigers and lions, even though they can mate with one another, they don't, because of habitat or ecological isolation. But again, take that away, grizzly and polar bears, they can successfully mate, making the growler bear. It's just not going to be very common. Okay, so that wraps up then all of the information that you need for Unit 1. And so as always, please know that you can send me an email if you have any questions whatsoever about any of this material or any of the labs that complement the lectures. Thank you for listening, guys. Have a great day.